present to you guys topic 3, population, just as a unit review. I hope that you're all well. I know that this is basically new for everybody, and we just got to get through it together. I'm hoping that you're all still preparing for your schoolwork, and we got to try to make the best of it. So I hope this works and kind of helps in terms of reviewing topic 3. So topic 3 is population. So it affects, of course, populations in the ecosystem, but also human populations. This is also chapter 8 in your book. So I really do recommend you go to the chapter. Here are vocabulary words that can help you. As you're going through the chapter, remember, as I always say, look at the pictures and diagrams. They usually emphasize the important information. In terms of moving forward from our ecology unit, don't forget that we have different levels of organization. So when we're talking about populations, obviously they're within that community of different populations, which is also part of an ecosystem, which is part of a biome, part of the biosphere. Also, what a population is basically a group of organisms of the same species, right? The same individual species level. And remember, species are organisms that can mate and reproduce fertile offspring. So when you're looking at populations, they can also be distributed in different ways. And so here we have clumped. Okay, so like if you have a pack of wolves, you would usually see them in a pack. So that would be clumped. While trees, for example, might be found in a random distribution. We really don't see a lot of uniform in the ecosystem unless they're like traveling together, like a school of fish, right? Or a flock of seagulls. Or if we have like a monoculture of trees where we've planted some kind of plantation. All right. And here we've got some R versus K selected. I like to remind you that the R should be a little r. And I think that's significant because the big K, capital K selected are your larger animals. They have very few young, and those are mainly like your large mammals, for example. So anytime you're talking about R selected and K selected, I want you to remember reproduction. So this has to do with the biotic potential of the organism. K selected are not highly potential in terms of reproduction. They don't have a lot of babies, but they do invest in those offsprings. They put in a lot of time and energy in nurturing the offspring. While R selected, they have lots of babies. There's really no care in terms of the offspring. They reproduce early and they develop pretty quickly. So some examples would be like mosquitoes, insects, amphibians. And so when you're looking at, for example, invasive species, we saw like with the cane toads, they were mostly R selected. And that's, we saw that the cane toad was able to lay thousands of eggs, and they were able to reproduce very quickly and develop very quickly without any paternal or maternal care. In terms of habitats, like if we're talking about the niche of the organism, the food that it eats, what's its role in the food web, then we can compare a generalist versus a specialist. And so here you can see that a generalist has a wider niche. So here you don't have a lot of competition in terms of food. The generalists will be able to eat different types of prey and possibly move around different forms of habitat, while a specialist has a very narrow niche, okay? Only eats specific things and lives in a specific habitat. In terms of how they got to be this way, well, if you look at a very diverse system, ecosystem, like a coral reef or like a rainforest, where food is available, good temperature, right? Water available. And so everybody wants to live there, right? Everybody wants to live in a rainforest because it has great conditions to live in. well, you're going to have a lot of competition. And so to ease that competition, species specialize. And so by specializing, you're lessening that competition, because now you're narrowing your niche. So you don't have to compete a lot with others. So that's good for organisms sharing an ecosystem like a rainforest, being specialized, but also makes you vulnerable to changes, because the generalists will be better adapted to changes. They can tolerate changes more, while the specialists cannot. So if you have something happen to that ecosystem, they will be more vulnerable to extinction. Also, they would be more vulnerable to invasive species. So invasive species will affect specialists more. Invasive species themselves, though, tend to be generalist, right? So like we saw the cane toad, or even if we're talking about the lionfish or the Burmese python in the Everglades, they tend to eat anything. So you can already see that the invasive species, between being R-selected and being generalists, and then if you're put into an ecosystem where you don't have any natural predators, you're really allowing that population to flourish. In terms of survivorship, we have 3 types: type 1, type 2, and type 3. So type 1 and type 2 are going to be your K-selected species, while your type 3 will be your R-selected. And this makes sense because K-selected, they don't have a lot of babies, but the babies they do have get nurtured. There's a lot of parental care, a lot of energy put into that, and so chances are they're going to survive. And so they really don't start to die off until they get older, right? Type 3 are R-selected, and it makes sense because R-selected, they have a lot of babies because they have a high mortality rate. A lot of babies are just not going to make it to adulthood. Let's say, for example, sea turtle will have a lot of babies, 100 eggs, let's say, per nest. Well, only 1% of that will actually make it to adulthood. In terms of the type 1 and 2, you can see here some examples. So type 1 would be the big mammals, and like humans would be involved in that. Type 2, mainly like your birds, you have that gradual increase of mortality with age. And type 3, like we said, we would have insects, fish, amphibians, and so make sure you know the 3 types. Here we have basically how a population is affected by the ecosystem. So carrying capacity refers to how much an ecosystem can sustain in terms of populations there. And so when you have plenty of food available, you don't have predators to worry about, all the conditions are just right, the population will increase dramatically, right? And you can see then that exponential growth of that population. But eventually you start limiting resources. Eventually you're going to start running out of food. Eventually there's going to be more competition for that food. And so the ecosystem's limiting factors will push down on that growth and will stabilize it. And so you can see that easy curve here. Now, realistically, sometimes though, you really see this purple one in that populations can increase exponentially and can even go past the carrying capacity of the area. That's what we call an overshoot. But this happens in a very short period of time because very quickly, again, those limiting factors will push down on that growth. So let's say something happens in the environment where suddenly now you're going to have a lot of food available. Well, you might have that overshoot, but then of course it'll come down, crashing down. Humans are living, right, in an overshoot right now. We are overpopulating more than can be sustained with our resources. And so you might see then this up and down, but you can still look at it stabilizing with the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity can also be referred to as K. Please don't confuse this and think that this is the K selected. It's just K. K is for the carrying capacity. And here this shows you again the different growths. So you have exponential growth, which is the J curve, and logistic growth, which is the S curve. In nature, we mostly, you can have exponential growth, but limiting factors in the ecosystem will stabilize it. And so what will stabilize it? What are these environmental factors again? So you should be able to identify them and talk about them in an FRQ. So don't forget, water is essential for life. So how much water is available, which is why a rainforest, for example, would be a great place to live because it has plenty of water. Space is another one. You need substrate. So for example, coral reef, you have substrate there, you have structure. Food is plentiful. If there's predators in the area, it's going to limit, and of course, disease. And so these are all the factors that can push down on an ecosystem population, right? You can even have like a hurricane, a storm. All of that also can push down. So here you can see that exponential growth, and then it gets stabilized, pushed down by those limiting factors. In terms of predator and prey, that the amount of predators obviously is going to limit the population of prey. So here you can see that the prey population, as it has increased, is going to attract more predators in the area. So naturally, those predators will start to feed on the prey and have more babies. The prey population will start to decrease. But as the prey population decreases, eventually the predator population will start to decrease as well as they run out of food. And so as they run out of food, they're going to have less babies. They might have to leave the area, and that'll give time for the prey population to recover and come back up. So what kind of feedback loop will this be? So yes, this will be a negative feedback loop, and this is how most of the loops are in an ecosystem. Now, in terms of other limiting factors, we talked about that predator-prey relationship. That would be a density-dependent factor, right? But there's also density-independent factor. If I applied this to what's going on right now with the human population, the reason, we're quarantined is because of this coronavirus, which is a disease that's affecting human population. Would that be a density-dependent factor or a density-independent factor? Well, we see that it's definitely a density-dependent factor. The more densely populated an area, the higher chance of transmission for that virus, which is why we're quarantined. We want to make sure that we stay distant, right? We have that social distancing. So that way the virus has a harder time transmitting from one host to the next, and that'll give it time to kind of just die off or level off. And so that would be a density-dependent factor. We also see that areas that are highly populated, that are densely populated, like the city of New York, for example, have more of that transmission of coronavirus than an area that's rural. A density-independent factor would be like, here it says, a drought, a hurricane, a fire. Things like that would not really care about how large the population is. It would happen regardless, right? So those would be density-independent factors. So I'll stop there, and then I'll give you part 2 in a bit.